Masechet Gittin Daf Mem Het. Yesterday we saw machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish. In the case of someone who owns a field and someone else buys the rights for the produce for this year or a few years. The one who buys the rights to the produce, he's going to have the fruit and he's going to bring the bikurim. Rabbi Yochanan says not only does it bring the bikurim, he can also say mikra bikurim. He can say, yes, thank you for giving me this land. Whereas Resh Lakish says, no, it doesn't. He doesn't own the land, and therefore, yes, he does bring bikurim, but he cannot say the mikra bikurim. Now we are bringing another machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish that is based on the same principle. V'azdu l'ta'amaihu, they are consistent with their reasoning, and a different machloket. Itmar hamocher sadehu bizman shehovel noheg. Rabbi Yochanan amar mevi vekoreh. Resh Lakish amar mevi ve'eno koreh. If someone sells his land during a time when Yovel is in practice. When Yovel is in practice, that means every 50 years, any ancestral land that's sold reverts back to its owner. Therefore, all sales are in a way temporary, or in other words, if it's my ancestral land and I'm selling it to you, I'm really not selling you the land itself. I keep the land. Rather, I'm selling you the produce for a given number of years, right? It's in the middle of Yovel. So then we actually calculate how much is the produce for 25 years. And that's the sale amount. So in effect, it's the same thing, even though we're calling it here, I'm selling you my land, but really the land goes back to me. So you can think of it as reverting to me, even though you owned it, or you could think of it as I owned it the whole time and you just own the rights to the produce during that period. And therefore, it's a parallel case. And here too, Rabbi Yochanan says, Mevi vekoreh. While you have the land, you can bring bikurim and you can say mikra bikurim, because it's the same as if you bought just the produce and not the land. And Resh Lakish says you can bring bikurim, but you cannot say it because it's not your ancestral land. You have the land now, you can use it for now, but you don't really own it because you're going to have to give it back. And now we explain again the same reasoning as we said yesterday. Rabbi Yochanan amar mevi vekoreh kinyan perot kekinyan haguf dameh. Resh Lakish amar mevi ve'eno koreh kinyan perot lav kekinyan haguf dameh. Rabbi Yochanan says the reason why you can say mikra bikurim is because he thinks that acquiring the produce is the same as acquiring the land itself. What does it mean to own land? I mean, you can't even, you can't hold it in your hand. You can't take it with you. Ownership of land means that you can use it and take whatever it produces. So that's the same as owning the land. It'll go back later, but that's fine. So therefore you can say, thank you for this land you have given me. Resh Lakish says, no, the acquiring of the produce is only the produce, and land ownership is a different thing, and you acquire the produce, but not the land. The ancestral land stays under the ownership of the ancestral owner forever. Even in the middle of the Yovel. Usricha. Now we say, why do we need to bother to mention the machloket in the case of a sale, above a sale of produce only, and as also in the case of sale during Yovel? Can't you figure out one from the other? Usricha. Di'am'itemar behahi beikam Resh Lakish techi kanachit adata de pera kanachit. Ava behach adata de gufe kanachit ema modele l'Rabbi Yochanan. If I only had the machloket above, I would say in that case, Resh Lakish says when the person goes and takes the field, he's taking the field only for the produce, because he said outright, I'm buying this field just for the rights of the produce. But in the case of Yovel, where he's saying I'm buying the field, then you might think that Resh Lakish would agree with Rabbi Yochanan that in that case he's acquiring the field, even if it's for 25 years or however long it is. You might think that that's really called acquiring the land itself, and you can say mikra bikurim. So that's why we need this case here to teach us that Resh Lakish thinks that even in the Yovel case, he's not actually acquiring the land. And if I had only this machloket here regarding Yovel, Beha kama Rabbi Yochanan, ava behach ema modeh le'shakish sericha. I would say that Rabbi Yochanan thinks that only in the case of Yovel, that's where like I'm basically acquiring the land. I mean, the deed says I'm buying your land. Happens to be it's going to go back, but I would say Rabbi Yochanan only says I can say mikra bikurim when I'm actually buying the land in the middle of Yovel. But if it says in the sale I'm only acquiring your produce and it says not the land, then I might think that Rabbi Yochanan would agree with the Shakish that then I can't say that thank you Hashem for the land. And that's why I need that machloket above as well, so to teach me that Rabbi Yochanan and Shakish disagree in both cases. Good. Now, Tashema. Hakone ilan vekarkao mevi vekore. We're going to have an attempted proof supporting Rabbi Yochanan from this Mishnah in Masechet Bikurim. It says someone who buys a tree along with the land, you say mikra bikurim. We are assuming that this Mishnah is talking about a case when the Yovel is in practice, and even though I bought the land in the middle of the Yovel, and the land is going to go back to its original owner, yet you say mikra bikurim. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says. Resh Lakish, how are you going to explain it? And the answer is hacham eskinan bisman she'ena Yovel noheg. Resh Lakish could say this Mishnah is talking about a time period when the Yovel is not in practice. After the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash, Yovel was not in practice anymore. When the Jews were no longer on their land, most of the Jews were no longer on their land, and so that's when, in fact, the Mishnah is compiled in 200. Significantly after the Bet HaMikdash is destroyed and the Jews were no longer in the majority on the land. And so Resh Lakish says, talking about when Yovel is not and does not apply like nowadays, and so a sale is a final sale. And so if I sell you a tree and it's land, then of course you should say mikra bikurim. You're going to keep it permanently. Good. Tashema. Hakone shene ilanot betoch sadeo shel havero mevi ve'eno kore. Hashelosha mevi ve'kore. Another Mishnah in Masechet Bikurim says, if I buy 2 trees in your field, then I bring the bikurim, but I cannot recite. Because 2 trees, that means I'm only acquiring the produce of the trees and not the land itself. But that means 3 trees. That means I'm acquiring 3 is already, you call it a grove. I'm acquiring all 3, and that assumes with the land. And you bring and you do it. So in that case, you would say mikra bikurim. This proves that Rabbi Yochanan, assuming that's a time of Yovel, and even though the land will go and the trees will go back to you, nevertheless, while I own it, and enjoy it, I say mikra bikurim. Proof for Rabbi Yochanan. What's Shakish going to answer? He can give the same answer. No, this Mishnah is assuming a time when Yovel is not in practice and is not going to revert to its owner, so a sale is a final sale. Good. והשתא דמד רב חיסדא מחלוקת ביובל שני, אבל ביובל ראשון דברי הכל מביא וקורא. דקתי לה סמך דעתיהו לקשיא הביובל ראשון הביובל שני. Now we're going to offer a different answer to these 2 challenges that Resh Lakish could give, and this answer is based on a new distinction that we heard from Rav Chisda. He was a Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshivat Surah. Apparently what we learned before was from a different yeshiva, so they gave her the interpretation. Resh Lakish could say this is after Yovel is no longer in practice. But Rav Chisda, he said that this machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Lakish is only in the 2nd cycle of Yovel, assuming that Yovel started at the time of Yoshua bin Nun, when he came into the land. So they when they first acquired the land, then they started counting 1, 2, 3. Until 50. Now, anything that was sold during that first 50 years, people didn't know what was going to happen at the end of 50 years, even though they had the Torah, and the Torah says that it's going to go back to the ancestral home, but it never happened yet, and so people weren't quite used to the idea. So therefore, during that first cycle, everyone would agree that you can say mikra bikurim, because during that first cycle, if I sold you some land, we would both assume that this is a permanent sale. They weren't used to the idea that it's going to go back, right? Because was they were not relying on it coming back, and so they thought of it as a final sale. And therefore, if I acquired your land, I would say, oh yeah, now it's my land. I'm thinking that's going to be forever during that cycle. Now during the next cycle, after it happens once, right? Yoshua says, oh, everybody, Yovel, all land is going back. Oh, now we realize how this works. So if someone sells from that 50-year mark forevermore, until while Yovel is still in practice, then they would know that the sale is temporary and it's really only a sale of produce, and so now that's where the machloket is when Yovel is in practice. It's kind of the same answer, except the one before was after Yovel is no longer. Resh Lakish answered after the Yovel is no longer in practice. But now that we know this distinction, we could give a different answer for Resh Lakish. It's before the Yovel was accustomed to, and so. This would be in Yovel Rishon. Those two Mishnayot would be in the first Yovel when they thought sales were final, and that's why it said Mikra Bikurim. Whereas the machloket is in Yovel Sheni, that's when you would not say Mikra Bikurim. Okay, good. So now we've been able to solve that problem. A tangent, by the way, is interesting because Rav Chisda is a third-generation Amora, and someone says, oh, now that we heard from Rav Chisda, this third generation, we can give a different answer than we gave before, which sounds like the answers that they gave before were early on, sometime before they at least heard what Rav Chisda says. This might be a good example of an early stam. Usually the anonymous voice of the Talmud, we assume, is the later editorial verse after the Amoraim. But here it looks like it's an early stam because they gave a couple of answers in some yeshiva, and maybe not the yeshiva of Surah. And then they heard, oh, Rav Chisda said that, and it sounds like, maybe a generation after Rav Chisda said that, or even sooner after, they said, oh, we heard that Rav Chisda said that, now we can give a different answer than what we said before. So I think this is a good candidate for an early stam. All right, lema ketanaeh. Now that we know that we have Rabbi Yochanan and Shakish having two different opinions, can we try to line it up with the following two Tanaim in this Baraita? Minayin lalokeach sadeh me'aviv v'kedisha ve'achar kach met aviv minayin sheteheh lefanav kesadeh ahoza. Before we get into this, we're going to have to see a little intro, which is the basic Peshat laws that are presented in Sefer Vayikra at the last chapter, regarding if someone sanctifies, makes hekdesh his land. What are the laws? So it's a little bit complicated, not too complicated, but we need to know this in order to understand the next Talmud. It says if someone takes his own ancestral land and makes it Yekdish, and he makes it Ekdesh LaHashem, so then you have to calculate the amount of how many seasons of produce it will produce, and that will be the amount. And if it's from the Yovel, then you calculate that amount. It's 50 shekel to a chomer of barley seed. Okay. Now, if it's after the Yovel, then you have to figure out how many years until the next Yovel. The idea is that if I have ancestral land and I donate, I dedicate it to the Bet HaMikdash, well, I'm not dedicating the land itself, but rather the amount of produce it will produce from now till Yovel, and then I will get it back. So if I do that, I'm going to have to calculate and donate that amount. Now, when I consecrate it, it's going to belong to the Bet HaMikdash. If I want it back, I have to redeem it. When I redeem it, I have to calculate all that produce and add 20%. So that way, it's a way of giving a donation. I can give a donation of any amount. And so I'm donating my field. It means now the field is Hekdesh, and I can redeem it by paying that amount of produces plus 20%. Now, what if I don't redeem it? I don't pay. I just say this is consecrated, and the 50th year comes, and I never redeemed it. If the temple treasurer, the Kohen, says, oh, this is sanctified, and they decide to sell it. The Bet HaMikdash, they're busy with a lot of things. They may not want to go and actually work this land, so they may say, oh, thank you for consecrating the land. We are going to donate it, we are going to sell it, rather, to some other farmer. He'll farm it, right? And then we'll take that money of that sale. So once they do that, then the ants, if it was my field originally, I don't get it back, right? I have to make sure to redeem it before the Yovel comes. If I consecrate it and the Kohen sells it, then and Yovel comes, then the Kohen, the Bet HaMikdash, is considered the new ancestral owner, and they don't get it back. Okay, very important halacha. It will go to the Kohanim. Now, that's case one. Case two. Let's say I buy a field from someone else. It's not my field. I bought it in the middle of Yovel. And while it's mine, I make it Ekdesh. Now, this pasuk is the one we're going to analyze the most. It says, if there's a field that I bought, that's not my ancestral field. You see, there's a doubling. If I bought it, then obviously it's not my ancestral field. Why do you have to say this twice? That's what the Tanaim in the following Baraita are going to address. In that case, when I consecrated a field that I bought, then I would have to pay the amount of the assessment until the Jubilee year, the amount of produce that it will produce. When the Yovel comes, it goes back to the ancestral owner, so that because I bought it, I don't have a right to consecrate it permanently to the Bet HaMikdash. If it was, the first case was the ancestral owner, he gives it and he doesn't redeem it, then now it belongs to the Kohanim forever. But if I just bought it, I don't even have a right to it myself once the Yovel comes. And so therefore, even if nobody redeems it, it's going to go back to the ancestral owner. And I mean, I have to pay because I donated that amount, so I have to pay that amount, but the land goes back. Okay, that is the basic law of the Torah. Now let's go back and see how the Tanaim interpret this. Now Tanaim are going to apply that pasuk, that doubled pasuk, to the following case. You have a son who buys a field from his father. The father is the ancestral owner. While the father is alive, the son decides to buy it. And he makes it Hekdesh while it's his. But then, before Yovel comes, the father dies, and now the son inherits. So how are we going to treat this? The son, on the one hand, bought it, but then he also inherited it. So do we treat him like a buyer? In which case, the land does, and let's say he doesn't redeem it. If he's a buyer and he doesn't redeem it, then the land goes to the ancestral owner, which happens to be himself now, so he gets it back. But if we treat him like an inheritor, then he is the ancestral owner, and he had now consecrated it, and therefore it stays in the hands of the Kohanim. That's the machloket about this case. So the first opinion of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon says, how do you know that we treat it like a sedeh achuzah, even though at the time that I sanctified it, I was just a purchaser? Once the Yovel comes, I'm the ancestral owner, so then it stays with the Kohanim, because now I'm an ancestral owner. How do I know that? From this pasuk, Tamod Omar, imet sedeh miknato asher lo misedeh achuzato. If you apply this law, the law that it goes back to the ancestral owner, you apply if the one who sanctified it is a buyer and not the ancestral owner. That doubled words means sadeh she'ena re'uya lihiyot sedeh achuzah yasta zo she'ruya lihiyot sedeh achuzah. So this applies only to a field that cannot even potentially be inherited, and excludes a field that can potentially be inherited. So even though I, as the son, consecrated it while I was a buyer, even so, I was also a potential inheritor. And so therefore, it's treated as if it's an inheritance, and therefore afterwards, when I do inherit it, before the Yovel comes, so it is treated as an ancestral land, and therefore it goes to the Kohen because they didn't redeem it before the Yovel came. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. We're going to see how this is all relevant in a minute. First, we have to understand the Baraita itself, then we'll see the application to Rabbi Yochanan and Shakish. That's all one opinion. Rabbi Meir Omer, Minayin lalokach sadeh me'aviv, umet aviv, v'achar kach hiktisha, minayin sheteh lefanav kisadeh achuzah. Rabbi Meir is going to switch around the order of the actions. He says that it's talking about a son who buys the field from his father, then the father dies, and after the father dies, then the son sanctifies it. So the son sanctifies it after he already inherits. So in that case, it's clear he's sanctifying a land that he is the ancestral owner of. So in that case, how do you know that we treat him like the ancestral owner? This case, it's actually kind of obvious that you would, because he is the ancestral owner. Talmud Omar, im et sedeh miknato asher lo misedeh achuzato, sedeh shena sedeh achuza, yasta zo shehi sedeh achuza. So here they're learning the pasuk in a more straightforward manner. They're not reading so much in. And this law that it would go back to if the buyer if a buyer donated, it would go back to the ancestral owner at the Yovel and not be given to the Kohen. That only applies to land that is not inherited, and in this case, it was inherited and is the ancestral property of the son. And so that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir says it would go to the Kohen only if you do it in this order. But if it was done in the other order, the one up here, and it was bought and then sanctified and only then inherited, then he would say he's treated like a buyer, and even though he didn't redeem it, the son would get it back because when he donated it, he was a buyer. That would be the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Good. Ve'ilu Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shimon met aviv v'achar kach hiktisha la tzarich hakera. Now Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, they say that in this case of Rabbi Meir, that's so obvious. You don't even need a pasuk for that because the father died, the son inherited, and only then he donated it. So the son is donating it as the ancestral owner. So you don't need a pasuk. Now, what's the essence of their machloket? Ma'ila behakami palge. Rabbi Meir savar kinyan perot ki kinyan haguf dameh. Rabbi Meir must think that acquiring produce is like acquiring land, and like the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. And therefore, when the son first bought the land while the father was alive, so when he bought the produce, he bought the rights to the produce, that's like buying the land itself. Ubeha b'mitat aviv hu de la yaret v'la midi. Ve'hilka, and since it's like he owned the land already itself. When the father dies, he doesn't inherit anything because he already owned it. He already bought it from the father, so he didn't inherit anything. Therefore, he's still a buyer, according to the Rabbi Meir. Therefore, I need a pasuk in this case, right? We said, why do we even need the double language? Isn't this obvious? So Rabbi Meir says it's not obvious because he's following Rabbi Yochanan, who says that when the son buys it, it's like he owns it already, and therefore when the father dies, he's actually not inheriting it, so he's not considered an inheritor, he's really considered a buyer. Therefore, even though he bought it, then inherited it, then sanctified it, without the pasuk, I would still think he's a buyer because the inheritance didn't apply to anything. So I think he should be considered a buyer, and therefore the doubling of the pasuk teaches me that even though he didn't inherit anything, because perot is like land, nevertheless we treat him like an ancestral owner who inherited it. Okay, that would explain the Rabbi Meir, why he needs the pasuk. And Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon Savre, they don't need the pasuk for that. They need it for the other case where it's switched. Kinyan perot lav ki kinyan haguf dameh. They think that acquiring something just for the produce, any kind of temporary acquisition that would go back to the owner, is not like taking the land, like buying the land, and therefore when the son buys it, he doesn't yet own the land. And therefore when the father dies, only then does the son actually take possession of the land. And for that reason, in the case where the father died, when he bought it, then the father dies, then he sanctified it, then you don't need a pasuk for that, because that's the same as any regular case of inheritance, because now he is inheriting something more than from when he bought it. And there, obviously, he is the ancestral owner, and he donated it. So now it's going to be treated like that, and going to stay with the kohen. You don't need a pasuk for that. Therefore, the doubling of the pasuk must be for the case that they brought when he bought it, then sanctified it, and only then inherited it. And to teach that in that case, he's considered like someone who inherits, and it goes back to and it stays with the kohanim. Okay, and so this is assuming, and the Bishimon is assuming that acquisition of produce is not like acquisition of the land, and that was the opinion of Resh Lakish. So you see, these two Amoraim match up with these two Tanaim, which we never actually like, because we don't want to box in and limit any Amorah to have to be like only one Tana. We'd rather that Amorim can be like any Tana. And so we answer, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Leolam emalach be'alma, kasab Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shimon kinyan perot ke kinyan haguf tameh. In fact, you can explain it all. Even Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon say that, in general, acquiring produce is like acquiring the land itself. But here they saw a difficulty in the pasuk, and they said we need to explain it. The pasuk, even with the doubling, could have said if it's a field that he acquired that was not ancestral. Why do you have to now go repeat misedeh achuzato? You have to repeat sadeh and sadeh again. So that extra, it's actually triple thing. There's three things that we can learn from here, because there's so many extra words. So from that extra we learn sadeh shena reuya liot sadeh achuza yasta zo shereuya liot sadeh achuza. We are going to exclude any field that even has the potential to be an ancestral field. In this reading, all the Tanaim agree with Rabbi Yochanan that acquiring produce is like acquiring the land itself. And therefore, I need one of the doublings to teach me that in the case where first the son bought it, and then he inherited it, in which case the inheritance is not doing anything because he already owned the land, and then sanctified it, even though it sounds like he should be treated as a buyer. Even nevertheless, one of the doublings teaches me that he's treated as an inheritor. That's one of the doublings. The other doubling teaches me further the other case that they said, which is if one bought it first and then sanctified it and only then inherited it, in which case for sure it seems like he should be treated like a buyer because he sanctified it after he bought it. Nevertheless, even the potential to be an inheritor makes him like an inheritor, and therefore it's treated as an ancestral piece of land, and it goes to the Kohanim. So they learned two things from this pasuk, whereas Rabbi Meir only learned one thing, but in fact they can all agree like Rabbi Yochanan. All right, that will be a strong argument for Rabbi Yochanan. And now we're going to see the final conclusions of various Amoraim supporting either Rabbi Yochanan or then Resh Lakish. Amar Rav Yosef, Ilav Amar Rabbi Yochanan kinyan perot ki kinyan naguf tameh lo masay yadav ragla bebet hamidrash. He's like, thank heavens for Rabbi Yochanan. If not that Rabbi Yochanan said that by acquiring produce is like acquiring the land itself, we would not be able to find his hands and his feet in the Bet HaMidrash. In other words, we'd have big problems. Amar Rabbi Aseh, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Actually, Rabbi Yochanan himself would have problems, and he would not be able to defend himself in the Bet Midrash, because a different statement that Rabbi Yochanan says, "Ha'achin shechalku lakochoten u'mahazirin ze laze ba'yovel." If you have brothers who inherit something, inherit from their father, and then they decide to split it. When they split it, they're considered purchasers, and therefore when the Yovel comes, the two brothers have to return to each other this half the land and that half the land that they split. They have to return the halves to each other and split it again. Now, what would be the problem? If he didn't say that kinyan hagu, that acquiring produce is like acquiring land, if he thought that it's not like acquiring the land, that means that hardly anyone would ever be able to say mikra bikurim. Anytime you have a father with two or more sons, we would consider those two sons to be buyers of the produce only, because they're like buyers, and the land is going to go back to each other. So the land, they don't own the land. The other one owns the land, but they themselves don't own. They own the land. The inheritance owns the land, so it's going to go back to that kind of shared inheritance. But the brothers themselves only buy temporarily the produce until the Yovel. As such, if you said that produce is not like buying the land, then they would not be able to say Mikra Bikurim. Who would be able to say Mikra Bikurim? Only Yoshua ben Nun could say it, because he inherited the land. If someone from that time had one son, and that son had only one son forever, so then one son who inherits from his father, then he's not considered a buyer, because he inherited the entire land. And so if you find a family that can trace their lineage to have one son only, all the way back to the time of Yoshua ben Nun, that person would be able to say Mikra Bikurim, but that's basically impossible. And so therefore, anyone else who anywhere along the line had two sons, those two sons would be buyers, and therefore forevermore we could not say that it's their ancestral land, but rather they're just buyers. When they die, then their sons are bought land, not ancestral land. And so therefore it's a good thing Rabbi Yochanan said that acquiring produce is like acquiring the land, and therefore two brothers who split it, even though they're only buying produce temporarily and the land belongs to the shared estate, nevertheless, it's as if they bought the land and they can still say Mikra Bikurim. Okay, so anyway, Rabbi Yochanan is consistent, and therefore he can defend himself in the Bet Midrash. But now we're going to bring proofs for Resh Lakish. Amar Rava, Kera umatnita mesaye'e le Resh Lakish. Rava says, I have a pasuk and a braita that both support Resh Lakish. Kera b'mispar shene tebu'a yimkor lach. Pasuk says, when you sell land, then you don't cheat the buyer and by selling him the whole price of the land, but rather you have to calculate the number of crops from now until the Yovel. So what do you see from that? That selling land is really only selling crops, only selling produce. It's really not selling the land at all. That's what Resh Lakish said. Matnita detanya bechor notel pi shanayim basadeh hachozeret la'aviv bayovel. Here's a background. A bechor, he gets a double portion only of what the father owned at the time of his death. If the father was owed money, but it was not paid, and the father dies, the oldest son does not get a double of that amount. Later on, when the person pays, then they will all split that evenly. However, a bechor does get double the amount from a field that will go back to the father at the time of Yovel, even though at the time that he died, it was before Yovel. And so at that time, this other guy, the buyer, has it. Nevertheless, when the land goes back to, when the Yovel comes and the land reverts back to the ancestral owner, the son gets double. What you see from there is that we treat it as if the father owned it at the time of his death, so that the buyer is considered only a buyer of the produce, but the father still owns the land. And that is another proof for Resh Lakish. Amar Abaye, Naktinan Baal benichse ishto sarich harsha'a. Yet another statement that follows Resh Lakish. If a husband wants to, needs authorization with regard to his wife's property. Let's say he has to go to court to argue something on behalf of the property that his wife brought in. We're talking about michse melog, that the wife brings in and she keeps ownership, but the husband can use the produce. Now, in general, anytime you're going to go to court, only the litigant, only the owner of the field can go to court. If someone else is going to court, they need written authorization. I am representing that person. So the husband here is not considered the owner of the land. He has to get a writ of authorization from the wife. What do you see from here? That even though he's enjoying the produce during the marriage, he's not considered the owner. The wife is still the owner of the land, like Resh Lakish. One last caveat to this law of Abaye: "V'la maran ela de la nachit apere, aval nachit apere migu de mishta'e dina apere mishta'e dina agufa." We only say that the husband has to get rid of authorization from his wife when he is not arguing concerning the produce. Let's say he's has an argument concerning the land. Some guy came and is encroaching on the land and say, no, this land belongs to us, to my wife. Then he has to get rid of authorization. But if the lawsuit has to do with the produce, some guy is coming and taking the produce, then he doesn't have to get rid of authorization, because since the law is about produce and he is the litigant regarding the produce, so therefore he can represent himself and does not have to get authorization from his wife. Hadran alach hasholeya. That completes the fourth perek, and now we begin the fifth perek, which continues on the same theme of enactments that the rabbis made. Mipnei tikun ha'olam hanizakin shamin lahen be'idit ubal chov bebenonit uchutubat isha beziburit. Rabbi Meir omer af kitubat isha bebenonit. Generally, there were three levels of land. Idit is the best quality land, Benonit is medium quality, Ziburit is the lowest quality of land. We learn first that if a perpetrator causes damage to someone else, the victim, the perpetrator has to pay the victim back with using the best of his land. Now, it's going to be the same amount. Let's say he caused $1,000 worth of damage. So then there's equal value. A small amount of good quality land is the same as a bigger amount of low quality land. So it would be the same monetary value. Nevertheless, people generally would prefer a small amount of high quality land that is easier to work and produces better fruit, and easier to sell that fruit and so on, rather than a large amount of low quality land. Therefore, if someone is the victim of injury, so they deserve to get the best land, and that will prevent, hopefully, the perpetrators will be more careful and not cause damages again. Now, someone who has to pay back a loan, and they don't have cash to pay back, so then the lender would collect from medium quality land, right? This is just in the middle. And a ketubah v'nisha, the husband can pay using lowest quality land. And all these have a good tikkun olam. In this case, it would be to encourage the husband to pay. He's more likely to pay if he can use any type of land, and also more likely to marry in the first place if he knows that, if it should end in divorce or death, then I could pay with any land. So then he's more likely to enter into and guarantee the woman her ketubah. Rabbi Meir says, no, for ketubah, that's also benonit. It's actually kind of like a loan, right? He says, I will owe you this amount, and therefore it should be treated like a chov and also be benonit. And that also is better for the woman. And nifra'in min nechasim meshubadin b'makom sheyesh nechasim b'nei chorin afilu hen ziburit. One cannot pay from land that was sold if there is unsold land. In other words, if I owe you $1,000 and I don't have any cash, and I have land available, you can't go and say, I want to collect, even if my land is mortgaged to you, you can't go and collect from land that I already sold if I have land here. Even if the land that I have here available is the lowest quality land, that's what I give to you, rather than you can insist and say, I want benonit land, and I'm going to go collect from someone I sold it to. And this is also a good tikkun olam. We prefer not to have to repossess land from people who bought it, because that disrupts the economy. Every time you buy something, you kind of want to know that if I bought it, then I'm going to keep it. That's why we check the deeds now before you buy anything. So therefore, you have to take what's available first. If orphans have to pay something, their father owed money and now the orphans have to pay, they pay from the lowest quality land. We always want to protect as much as possible the assets of orphans. And motzi'in achilat perot v'lishbach karkaot ולמזון האישה והבנות מנכסים משועבדים מפני תיקון העולם. This is a little bit of a complicated case. If I steal land from you and I sell it to another guy, we'll call him the buyer. Now, eventually, you're going to go and get your land back. And so you go and repossess your land from the buyer. However, now the buyer is out many things. Number one, the purchase price. Number two, he also, in the meantime, let's see, he had it for a few months. Until you came and got it back. So he might have put money into the land, right, and bought materials and improved the land and produced fruit from it. And so now, when you go and take it back from the buyer is out all of that. Now the buyer can come to me because I'm the one that stole it in the first place. So regarding the value, the purchase price of the land, for that, if I have no money, he can go and collect from land that I sold to someone else. He can say, sorry, I get to take that land, and then I would have to pay that other guy back. So that he can take from sold land. However, the increase that the money that he put in, so that's shevach karkaot, the benefit, that enhanced value of the land, and the produce that grew while he owned it and was working it. For that, he can only collect from available property that I have. He cannot go and take from nechasim meshubadim. That's the full sentence. En motziin, for these things mi nechasim meshubadin. And also, if a husband dies, the law is that his estate takes care of his wife and his children and gives them mazon. And for that also, if the estate is depleted, then the wife and the daughters do not have the right to go and take from land that was from lien property that was sold. They cannot repossess land for that reason. And all these things are for the betterment of the world. And finally, in the Mishnah, HaMoseh Mesi'ah Lo Yishaba Mipnei Tikun HaOlam, if I find a lost item and I come and return it, I find a wallet and I return it to the owner. The owner cannot come and say, I want you to swear that you didn't take anything out of this wallet. I had $1,000 in the wallet. Now there's only 500. I want you to swear that you didn't take the 500. I'm the finder. I don't have to swear, right? Because if you're going to make me swear, I'm like, people don't want to swear. I won't return it in the first place. And therefore, I return it, and the finders who go and return something do not have to swear that they didn't take anything of it. All right, we're going to go now and ask about the first case. If someone injures someone else, then the perpetrator has to pay the best land. That's not tikkun ha'olam. That's an explicit pasuk. It says the best of his field or the best of his vineyard, he has to pay. Why are you including this in this list of rabbinic enactments? Amar Abaye la sricha ela Rabbi Ishmael da'amar midoraita bedinizak shaiminan kamashmalan mipnei tikkun ha'olam shaiminan bedemazik. This Mishnah is actually the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Ishmael says the Torah law, when we say the best of the land, we follow the victim, right? Let's say the perpetrator has better land, is richer than the victim, and so now the victim incurred $1,000 worth of injury, of damage, and so let's say I'm the perpetrator, I come to pay, I'm going to pay you the best land, and we evaluate the best land according to the best land of the victim, right? You get whatever you have as your best land, that's what I have to pay. That's the letter of the law mideoraita. The tikkun olam comes and says, you know what? We're going to assess from the best land of the perpetrator, right? And if I have my land, my level of best land is more, then I have to pay that amount, and that is good because then that will be more of a deterrent for me not to damage in the future. I'm going to have to give my best land. Okay, Mai Rabbi Ishmael. Now let's get the source. Where does Rabbi Ishmael say this? Tanya. Metav sadehu metav karmo yishalem. Metav sadehu shel nizak, metav karmo shel nizak divrei Rabbi Ishmael. So when the pasuk says the best of his land he shall pay, but that pronoun sadeh, who is it referring to? Rabbi Ishmael says it's the best land of the victim, or the best vineyard of the victim. Rabbi Ishmael omer lo ba katuv ela ligbot lenizakin min ha'idit kal v'chomer la hekdesh. Rabbi Akiva says no. The pasuk is coming and saying we are going to compensate to the injured party from the best land of the person who's paying, of the perpetrator. There's a kavachomer from there to hekdesh. If I cause damage to something that belongs to the temple, then I would certainly have to pay back from the best of my land. I will discuss this line a little bit more on the next daf. Okay, so this is the source of Rabbi Ishmael and how he argues with Rabbi Akiva. But now we're going to ask about the logic of Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Ishmael, achal shemena, meshalem shemena, achal kechusha, meshalem shemena. According to Rabbi Ishmael, I understand that, let's say my ox came and ate 1 square yard of your best fat land with fat vegetables on it, then I would have to pay back also with 1 square yard of fat vegetables. But what logic does it make for Rabbi Ishmael if my ox ate some kichusha, from skinny vegetables on bad land that you had, I should have to pay back the best? In other words, if you're going by the value of the victim, then it should be defined by what the victim lost. And we're assuming now we're talking about square yard for square yard, right? The same amount of space, not the value. So then it doesn't make any sense that if I destroy something that's of low value, that I should pay for the best value of your own land. It should always be the same. אמר רבי דיבר אבין, החמה עסקינן כגון שאכלה ערוגה בין ערוגות ולידין אני כחושה איש שמנה אכל דמשלם למימתיו. So Rabbi Bar Avin says that Bishmael here is talking about a case only where the ox went and ate some patch of vegetables, but we don't know which one it is. And we're not sure if it's the skinny one or the fat one. And therefore, we say, listen, it might have been the fat one, so I, the perpetrator, have to pay from the best quality of your vegetable, of your land, just in case my ox destroyed that 1 square yard of your best of the vegetables. So only in that case would I have to pay the best. If I know that If we know and we can prove that it was from the worst part of your vegetable patch, then I would have to pay only the amount of your worst part. Okay, so that's his answer. Amar Rava, ilu yadina dechusha achal meshalem kechusha, hashta delei yadina meshalem shemena. Rava says that doesn't make sense. If you know that it was from the worst part, you would pay from the worst part. So now if you don't know, I, the perpetrator, should have to pay for a higher amount. You're trying to extract money from me without proof, right? If you can prove that it was high quality land, then I'll pay you for your high quality land. But if you can't prove it, then I'm going to pay only for the smallest quality. That's the only thing that you can prove. And therefore, this is not a good answer. Ela maravacha bar Yaakov, hacha b'maiskenan kegon shayta idit nizak keziborit de mazik. Rabbi Ishmael sabar b'nizak shaminan, Rabbi Akiva sabar b'demazik shaminan. Rather, Ravacha bar Yaakov says, it doesn't go by the square yard, I'd have to pay 1 square yard for 1 square yard, but rather it's the value, right? We assess how much did it cause damage? It was $100 of damage, and so then we see, okay, so it's still going to be $100 worth of payment, but the question is of whose land, when it's when we are in different levels, so that the best land of the victim is equal to the worst land of the perpetrator. So that's the case where Rabbi Ishmael says we're going to use the best land of the victim. And the Rabbi Akiva says it's going to be the best land of the perpetrator. But either way, it'll be that $100 worth. So it's not square yard per square yard like we were saying before, because then that wouldn't make sense if I'm giving you back actual square yard and I know it's from something that was of low quality, then I should only have to pay of low quality. Rather, we're going to assess the quality first and assess, well, how much was the damage? Was it $100, $200? And then the only question is, when the payment comes, will it be from my best land, or from your best land? Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'amen.